He looked me in the eyes and told me to leave the house I paid for, raised him in, and protected for 25 years, as if I were a stranger who had overstayed his welcome. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not remind him of the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, or the mornings I worked overtime so he could have more than I ever did. I simply nodded, because in that moment I understood something important. When someone shows you how little they value you, the smartest response is to watch closely and remember everything. I am an old man now, or at least old enough to know that anger is loud but patience is powerful. What happened between me and my stepson did not begin that day. It had been forming quietly for years, like a crack in a wall no one wants to notice. I married his mother when he was still young enough to need guidance but old enough to test limits. I chose to step into a role that did not come with guarantees. I chose it because I loved his mother, and because I believed that showing up every day could build something real. For a long time, it felt real. I taught him how to drive. I showed him how to fix a leaking sink instead of calling someone else. I stood in the background at his graduations, never asking to be called anything special, never correcting him when he introduced me simply as his mother's husband. I understood my place. I accepted it. Respect, I believed, grows best when it is not demanded. But people change when they believe they no longer need you. That belief can be subtle at first. A different tone. Shorter replies. Decisions made without asking. He grew into his 20s, confident, ambitious, surrounded by people who praised his potential but never reminded him of responsibility. I watched quietly as he began to speak over me at the dinner table, correct me in front of others, and treat my advice like outdated noise. I told myself it was normal. Youth wants space. Pride wants proof. I stayed calm. I stayed useful. I kept working long hours even when my body asked me to slow down. I kept paying bills that no one thanked me for. I kept the house running smoothly because stability, I believed, was my duty. The house mattered to him more than he admitted. It was not just walls and furniture. It was leverage. It was comfort without cost. It was a place that allowed him to take risks without fear of falling too far. And because it had always been there, he assumed it always would be. The first time he hinted that I should consider leaving, he disguised it as concern. He spoke about independence, about how couples our age often downsize, about how I deserved peace somewhere quieter. He smiled when he said it, as if kindness could hide intention. I listened carefully and said nothing. Silence is not weakness. Silence is observation. Over time, the hints turned into statements. The statements turned into expectations. He spoke as if decisions were already made. He spoke as if my presence was temporary, inconvenient, easily replaced. And still, I waited. I waited because rushing justice only feeds regret. Before we continue, tell me something. Which country are you watching this video from right now? Drop it in the comments. Every story feels more real when I know who's listening. The day everything broke was ordinary. That is how these moments usually arrive. No warning. No drama. Just a conversation that reveals the truth. He told me he needed the space. He said the house was holding him back. He said it was time for me to figure something else out. Not asked. Told. I remember noticing how steady my hands were. That surprised me. I expected anger. I expected pain. Instead, I felt clarity. The kind that comes when confusion finally ends. In that moment, I realized he believed the house was already his. He believed my years were behind me and his were the only ones that mattered. What he did not know was how carefully I had prepared for the future. Not out of suspicion. Out of responsibility. I have always believed that love does not excuse carelessness. I had kept records. Agreements. Quiet safeguards that no one else paid attention to. Not because I expected betrayal, but because life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. I told him I would think about it. I thanked him for his honesty. That confused him. People expect resistance when they do something wrong. Calm makes them uneasy. He left the room certain he had won, unaware that victories claimed too early often collapse under their own weight. That night, I did not sleep much. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was clear and busy. I reviewed years in my head. Every compromise, every sacrifice, every moment I chose peace over pride. And I understood something else. Teaching someone a lesson does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires letting them walk confidently toward the consequences of their own choices. I began to plan, slowly and quietly, the way you do when you care more about the outcome than the applause. There would be no shouting, no threats, no dramatic exits. Just truth, delivered at the right time, in the right way, with patience that feels almost invisible. By the time morning came, I was calm again. Calm enough to make breakfast. Calm enough to smile. Calm enough to let him believe the story was over. In reality, it had just begun. After that conversation, something shifted inside the house, though no one spoke about it openly. He moved with more confidence, as if the walls had already agreed with him. He left his things spread out, claimed more space, made plans that assumed my absence. I watched it all the way a gardener watches weeds grow, not angry, just aware. I kept my routine unchanged. I woke early. I made coffee. I read the same news in the same chair. Consistency unsettles people who expect reaction. He began to test me in small ways. He would invite friends over without asking, speak loudly about future renovations, joke about how quiet the place would be once I found somewhere else. Each comment was a probe, checking for resistance. I offered none. In the evenings, I sat across from him at the table, listening more than speaking. He talked about ambition, about being held back, about how some people stay too long in roles they have outgrown. He never said my name when he said these things, but the message was clear. I nodded. I let him talk. People reveal more when they believe they are in control. What he did not understand was that patience is not passive. It is active restraint. Every night, when the house grew quiet, I opened old folders and reviewed documents I had organized years ago. Not in anger. In clarity. I remembered advice an older man once gave me. Never confuse kindness with carelessness. Love should never require blindness. I had contributed more than money to that home. I had built stability. I had signed agreements when others trusted words. I had kept records when others assumed loyalty. None of it was secret. It was simply ignored. He had grown up believing protection was permanent, not conditional. Days passed. Then weeks. His tone hardened. He stopped pretending his suggestions were optional. He spoke as if timelines were already set. He asked me once, almost casually, how soon I could manage a move. I smiled and told him I was still thinking. That answer frustrated him. Certainty feeds confidence. Uncertainty feeds doubt. He began to involve others. I noticed it in the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. In the way phone calls ended abruptly. In the way he looked at me, not with anger, but with calculation. That look told me he believed numbers were on his side. That belief would become important later. One afternoon, he sat across from me and listed reasons. Practical reasons. Logical reasons. He spoke as if presenting a case to someone he expected to convince. I let him finish. I thanked him for explaining his perspective. I told him I appreciated honesty. Then I asked him a simple question. I asked him if he remembered the first year after I married his mother. He paused. Not because he didn't remember, but because he hadn't expected the question. He shrugged. Said it was a long time ago. I agreed. I told him long time ago decisions still shape present realities. He dismissed it with a smile that suggested nostalgia had no legal standing. That was when I knew he saw the past as irrelevant. To him, history was emotional, not structural. He believed what mattered was who had momentum now. Youth often mistakes speed for direction. That night, I took a walk around the neighborhood. Same streets I had walked for decades. Same houses, some renovated, some abandoned. I thought about how quickly people forget who laid foundations once the paint starts to fade. I felt no bitterness, just understanding. The next morning, I received a message. Short, direct. He wanted to set a date to talk about logistics. I replied that any day worked for me. Calm words, carefully chosen. When you show no fear, others rush. The meeting was tense but quiet. He laid out expectations, time frames. He spoke as if compromise was already generosity. I listened. I asked clarifying questions. I took mental notes. He mistook my composure for acceptance. That mistake would cost him dearly. He ended the conversation by saying he hoped we could handle this like adults. I smiled again. I told him adults prepare for consequences. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. What he didn't know was that preparation had already been done. Years ago. In moments he never paid attention to. In decisions made quietly, responsibly, without drama. He believed power came from confidence. I knew it came from position. That week, I made a few phone calls. Not many. Not urgent. Just confirmations. Just questions answered. Each call reinforced what I already suspected. The structure was solid. The leverage was mine. All I had to do was choose timing. At home, he grew bolder. He spoke openly now, telling others I would be leaving soon. He corrected me in front of guests. He referred to the house as his future. Each word added weight to what was coming. I noticed something else too. He had stopped asking questions. He had stopped checking assumptions. He was building plans on confidence alone. Confidence without verification is fragile. One evening, he asked me directly why I wasn't upset. He said most people would be angry. I told him anger clouds judgment. I told him clarity lasts longer. He looked unconvinced. People who move quickly rarely respect those who move deliberately. That night, I slept deeply. Not because I was tired, but because my mind was settled. I knew exactly what would happen next. I knew how the truth would surface. And I knew that when it did, it would not need explanation. In the morning, I made breakfast again. I asked him about his plans for the week. I listened. I encouraged him. Encouragement disarms suspicion. He left the house confident, already living in a future that had not yet agreed to him. I stayed behind, standing in the quiet kitchen, looking around not with sadness, but with precision. Every object had a story. Every decision had a record. People assume silence means surrender. They forget that silence is often where strategy lives. By the end of that week, everything was in place. Not for confrontation. For revelation. And revelation, when timed correctly, does not shout. It simply stands there, undeniable, waiting for someone to finally look at it. He started acting like the house already belonged to him. Not in words. In behavior. He rearranged things without asking. Moved furniture. Replaced items that had been there for years. He spoke about his taste and modernizing, as if history were clutter. I watched him remove small pieces of the life I had built, one object at a time, believing each removal weakened me. What it actually did was show me how confident he had become. Confidence changes posture. It loosens discipline. It creates blind spots. He stopped coming home on time. Stopped explaining where he had been. Stopped pretending my opinion mattered. When he did speak to me, it was instructional, not conversational. As if I were an employee nearing retirement, not a man who had carried responsibility long before he learned what it meant. I adjusted nothing. I continued waking early. Continued cooking. Continued asking how his day went. Normalcy unsettles people who expect conflict. It makes them careless. One evening, he brought paperwork to the table. Not documents, just printed listings. Apartments. Condos. Smaller places. He slid them toward me gently, like an offering. He said he had done some research for me. I thanked him. That thank you surprised him more than anger would have. He explained the benefits slowly, carefully, as if speaking to someone fragile. He talked about affordability, about convenience, about how this would be better for everyone. I listened until he finished. Then I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in front of him. I told him I appreciated the effort. I told him I would take care of my own arrangements when the time came. He frowned. Not openly. Just enough. That was the first crack in his certainty. After that, his patience thinned. He began to rush. He talked about deadlines, about commitments he had made assuming my absence. He said people were counting on him. He said delays reflected badly on him. I asked him why. He said because progress requires decisiveness. I nodded. He did not notice that he had just admitted something important. Progress, to him, meant movement forward without confirmation. That week, he brought someone to the house without warning. A professional voice. Polite. Neutral. They spoke as if I were not in the room. They discussed measurements, options, costs. They spoke about future changes with absolute confidence. I poured coffee and listened. At one point, the visitor asked a simple question about ownership. There was a pause. A small one. Almost invisible. My stepson answered quickly. Too quickly. He spoke with confidence instead of clarity. I said nothing. Silence, in moments like that, is not avoidance. It is documentation. After they left, he acted relieved. He spoke more casually, joking again, as if the moment had passed. He assumed that because nothing happened, nothing mattered. That assumption would become his greatest error. Over the next days, he began telling others openly that I would be moving soon. I heard it secondhand. Casual comments. Assumptions repeated as facts. He had built a future in his mind and invited people into it before securing the foundation. I did not correct him. Correcting people early saves them. Letting them continue teaches them. One night, he asked me directly if I had found a place yet. I told him not yet. He sighed, loudly, impatiently. He said time was running out. I asked him whose time. He looked at me, confused. He said everyone's. I smiled slightly and told him time always runs out for those who rush. That irritated him. The irritation showed in small ways. Short answers. Sharp tones. Passive remarks. He wanted a reaction. He wanted proof that I was affected. I gave him none. Inside, I was not numb. I was focused. Every morning, I reminded myself that quiet revenge is not about winning. It is about balance. About restoring truth to a situation distorted by arrogance. I remembered something his mother once said years ago. That he had always mistaken support for permission. That when things went well, he assumed they always would. She had said it gently, without blame. She had been right. One afternoon, I noticed he was anxious. Checking his phone often. Pacing. Speaking fast. He mentioned a commitment he had made based on timelines that were now uncertain. I asked him what would happen if things did not go as planned. He laughed. He said they would. Certainty without confirmation again. That evening, he raised his voice for the first time. Not shouting. Just louder than necessary. He said the situation was becoming inconvenient. He said he needed clarity. He said I needed to decide. I waited until he finished. Then I told him something simple. I told him I had already decided. That caught his attention. He leaned forward, asked what I meant. I told him I had decided to let things unfold naturally. He didn't like that answer. People who believe they control outcomes hate uncertainty. He pressed me, asked what that meant for timelines. I told him timelines work best when everyone understands their position. He scoffed. He said positions were obvious. I agreed. That agreement unsettled him more than disagreement would have. That night, I reviewed everything one last time. Not because I doubted myself, but because confirmation is the final step before action. Everything aligned. Every assumption he had made was wrong. Every shortcut he had taken led exactly where I expected. I felt no excitement, only readiness. The next morning, he left early, confident again, rushing toward commitments built on belief rather than fact. I stayed behind, moving slowly through the house, not with nostalgia, but with awareness. This place had witnessed decades of patience. It had absorbed countless quiet decisions. It would now witness the return of balance. By the end of that day, the first consequence would surface. Not loudly, not cruelly, just clearly. And when it did, he would finally understand something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. That power borrowed from assumption always expires. And silence, when backed by truth, never does. The day after that quiet consequence surfaced, the house felt different. Not tense. Not hostile. Exposed. He did not say anything that morning. Neither did I. We moved around each other like two men sharing space without sharing understanding. That silence was not accidental. It was the first time he sensed that something existed beyond his control, and he did not yet know its shape. This part of the story did not begin with confrontation. It began years earlier, long before confidence turned into entitlement. I married his mother when I was still learning what patience meant. I had lived enough life to know love was not loud, but I had not yet learned how much quiet strength it required. She came with a past, responsibilities, and a son who watched everything carefully without saying much. I did not step into that family to replace anyone. I stepped in to support what already existed. In the early years, I made a decision that shaped everything that followed. I decided I would never compete for authority. I would earn trust instead. Children and young adults test power, but they respond to consistency. I showed up. Every day. Without announcements. I drove him to school. Helped with homework. Sat in uncomfortable chairs at events where my presence was acknowledged politely, never warmly. I accepted that. Love is not a contract. It is an investment. As he grew older, he learned quickly. He was sharp, ambitious, confident. He absorbed praise easily. He also absorbed something else. The idea that stability was automatic. That the floor beneath him existed regardless of how he treated the people who built it. His mother worried about that sometimes. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she would mention it gently. She said he never questioned how things worked, only assumed they would. I told her time would teach him. I believed that. When she passed, the house became quieter in a different way. Grief rearranges priorities. I stayed. Not out of obligation, but because walking away felt like abandoning a responsibility I had accepted long ago. He was already an adult by then, but adulthood does not mean independence. It means accountability, something he had not yet fully learned. In the years that followed, roles blurred. I became background support, financial stability, emotional distance. He grew into his independence without ever fully separating from the safety net beneath him. The house remained the center of everything. Not emotionally, but structurally. That structure mattered more than he understood. I handled finances quietly. I maintained systems no one asked about. I organized documents no one read. I did these things not because I distrusted anyone, but because order protects peace. Chaos invites conflict. He never asked how things worked. Never showed interest in details. To him, details were obstacles. He focused on outcomes. That was the imbalance. When he started earning more, his posture changed. He spoke differently. He interrupted more. He began to see the house not as shared history, but as future potential. He spoke about growth, about expansion, about next steps. I listened. I had learned long ago that when people talk about the future, they reveal how they see the present. He saw himself moving forward. He saw me standing still. That perception became belief. The first real shift happened months before he asked me to leave. It was subtle. A conversation where he referred to the house as temporary. A comment about how long I planned to stay. A suggestion that my needs were simpler now. I did not correct him. Correction changes behavior. Observation reveals intention. I noticed how quickly he accepted advice from people who had contributed nothing to his foundation. I noticed how easily he dismissed experience as outdated. He believed youth equaled relevance. He believed speed equaled progress. I remembered being young. I remembered believing the same. That memory kept me calm. What he never realized was that while he was measuring growth, I was measuring exposure. He was building plans upward. I was ensuring roots ran deep. Different priorities. Different timelines. When he finally told me to leave, it did not shock me. It confirmed what had already been forming. It confirmed that he believed support had an expiration date, and that once expired, it could be discarded. That belief shaped everything that followed. Now, after the first quiet consequence appeared, he was unsettled. He began asking questions. Casual ones. Careful ones. He wanted reassurance without admitting uncertainty. I gave him none. I answered truthfully, but incompletely. Truth does not require explanation when time is on your side. He began retracing conversations in his head. I could see it. The pauses before he spoke. The way he avoided certain topics. Doubt had entered, and doubt does not announce itself. It whispers. This was not revenge. This was alignment. I was not trying to hurt him. I was allowing reality to catch up to assumption. Over the next few days, he attempted normalcy. He joked again. Spoke casually. Acted as if nothing had shifted. But his confidence no longer rested easily. It wobbled. He asked me once if I had spoken to anyone about the situation. I told him I speak to the right people at the right time. That answer bothered him. People who rush need immediate reassurance. Delayed clarity feels like threat. He began making contingency plans. I saw evidence of it. Phone calls. Messages. Late nights. He was adjusting outcomes without fully understanding variables. That was when I understood how deeply he had underestimated me. Not intellectually. Structurally. He had never seen me as part of the system. Only as a component. Something removable. Replaceable. He had not realized that systems fail when you remove the part that holds records. This part of the story matters, because it explains why what came next felt inevitable, not dramatic. There was no anger driving it. No satisfaction. Only correction. I had built my life on the belief that fairness does not need noise. It needs time. As the days passed, I remained consistent. Polite. Present. I did not avoid him. I did not confront him. That balance unsettled him more than hostility would have. He was waiting for a fight. I was waiting for truth. By the end of that week, the ground beneath his plans had shifted just enough for him to feel it. Not collapse. Just movement. Enough to make him question assumptions he had never questioned before. This was the beginning of the setup. Not of revenge. Of reality. And once reality enters the room, it does not leave quietly. He tried to regain control by becoming reasonable. That was the new approach. He spoke slower. Asked questions framed as concern. He said he wanted everyone to feel comfortable. He said misunderstandings happen when communication breaks down. The words were calm, but the urgency beneath them was new. Reason, when it arrives late, is usually fear wearing manners. I listened the same way I always had. He asked me what my plans were now. I told him my plans had not changed. That answer unsettled him. He wanted movement, direction, proof that the situation was progressing the way he had imagined. Instead, he found stillness. Stillness makes impatient people reckless. He began revisiting old conversations. He asked what I meant weeks earlier when I said timelines work best when everyone understands their position. He asked whether I felt disrespected. He asked whether I was unhappy. I told him I was neither unhappy nor confused. I told him I understood the situation clearly. Clarity, when not shared, feels threatening. He asked if I thought he had handled things poorly. I paused before answering. Then I told him that handling is different from understanding. That response frustrated him. He wanted evaluation, validation, or conflict, anything but ambiguity. Over the next few days, he tried involving others again. Mutual acquaintances, advisors, people whose opinions carried weight in his world. He asked them questions designed to reassure him, not inform him. He wanted confirmation that his assumptions were normal, justified, supported. What he received instead was hesitation. Not opposition, just pauses. Clarifying questions. Cautious language. Those pauses bothered him deeply. People who build confidence on agreement struggle when agreement becomes conditional. One evening, he asked me if I thought he was being unfair. I told him fairness depends on perspective. He said that sounded like avoidance. I told him it sounded like experience. That ended the conversation. He began to realize that he did not understand the full structure of the situation. He had assumed authority without verifying position. He had spoken with certainty without checking boundaries. And now, slowly, the gaps were revealing themselves. He started asking about details. Ownership. Responsibilities. Agreements. Not directly. Indirectly. Carefully. He asked questions that sounded hypothetical but were not. He was mapping a landscape he should have studied years ago. The problem was that the map did not favor him. I answered truthfully when asked directly. I did not volunteer information. There is a difference. Each answer landed heavier than the last. Not because of what I said, but because of what it implied. He began to realize that his plans depended on assumptions that were no longer holding. His tone changed again. This time, it was defensive. He said he felt blindsided. I told him nothing had been hidden. He said he felt unprepared. I told him preparation requires curiosity. He did not like that. People who confuse entitlement with readiness rarely enjoy being reminded of the difference. He accused me, gently, of being strategic. I agreed. That admission surprised him. I told him strategy is what people rely on when emotions cannot be trusted to lead. I told him emotion creates noise. Strategy creates outcome. He asked whether I had planned all this. I told him I had planned my life responsibly. He fell quiet after that. That silence was different from the others. It was heavier, slower. It carried realization. For the first time, he saw me not as an obstacle, but as an unknown variable. Unknown variables frighten planners. He began backtracking in small ways. Softening language. Revising expectations. Suggesting alternatives. He spoke about compromise. About shared benefit. About finding solutions that worked for everyone. I listened. I told him compromise works best when both sides understand what they are giving up. He asked what I was giving up. I told him nothing I was not prepared to lose. That answer stopped him. He realized then that I was not negotiating from fear. I was negotiating from stability. Stability changes power dynamics. In the days that followed, his confidence eroded quietly. He did not collapse. He recalibrated. He started measuring words, watching reactions, reading situations he once dominated. He was learning, but late. I saw flashes of the boy I had once guided. Curious, uncertain, looking for footing. That softened something in me. Not enough to stop what was unfolding, but enough to remove any desire to hurt. This was not about punishment. It was about alignment. One afternoon, he asked me a question that revealed everything. He asked what would happen if things did not go his way. I told him then he would learn something valuable. He asked what? I told him that support is strongest when respected, and that security borrowed without gratitude eventually demands repayment. He did not respond. That night, he stayed up late. I knew because the lights stayed on. Because the house carried the weight of someone thinking too hard too fast. In the morning, he looked tired. He asked if we could talk later. I said of course. That was the first time he had asked instead of told. The conversation that followed was quieter than all the others. No lists. No arguments. Just acknowledgement that things were more complicated than he had believed. He admitted he had assumed too much. That mattered. I told him assumption is not a crime. Refusal to correct it is. He nodded. For the first time, he did not argue. But understanding does not erase consequences. It only prepares you to face them. He was beginning to understand. What he did not yet know was how close the full truth was to surfacing. And once it did, there would be no room left for assumption at all. The shift in him was subtle, but unmistakable. He began to move more carefully through conversations, like someone walking on ground that no longer felt solid. The certainty that once carried him had thinned into caution. He listened more, spoke less. And when he spoke, he measured words instead of throwing them. That told me everything. People do not slow down unless they sense risk. One evening, he asked if I ever felt like I had given too much. The question came without warning. No argument. No tension. Just curiosity edged with regret. I thought about it before answering. I told him giving is never the problem. Giving without clarity is. He asked what I meant. I told him clarity means knowing why you give, what it costs you, and when it must stop. He nodded, but I could see he was thinking about something else. Not philosophy. Structure. He was replaying decisions in his head, trying to locate the moment things had turned. People always look for a single mistake. Life rarely works that way. Over the next few days, he became unusually helpful. He cleaned. He asked if I needed anything. He offered to handle tasks I had always taken care of myself. The gestures were polite, but they carried weight. Guilt, when it arrives, often wears the mask of generosity. I accepted the help without comment. Refusal would have made him defensive. Acceptance allowed him to sit with his own discomfort. One afternoon, he asked me why I had never pushed back earlier. Why I had never asserted myself. Why I had let things go as far as they did. That was an important question. I told him pushing back teaches people where you stand. Waiting teaches them who they are. He looked down at the table after that. I could see him beginning to understand something he had never considered before. That restraint is not absence of strength. That silence is not agreement. That calm is often preparation. He admitted then that he had thought my patience meant I had no options. I told him patience often means you have more options than you need. That stayed with him. He began asking about the past. Not in detail, but with respect. He asked how I had managed responsibilities after his mother passed. How I had kept things running. How decisions had been made when he was focused elsewhere. I answered honestly. I told him responsibility does not announce itself. It just shows up every day. He listened quietly. That listening was new. But understanding does not erase momentum. The situation had moved too far forward for that. Plans had been spoken aloud. Expectations had been set. Others were involved now. Reality was already in motion. He sensed that too. One night, he said he felt like he had rushed things. I agreed. He asked if rushing always leads to mistakes. I told him rushing always reveals priorities. He did not ask what that revealed about him. He already knew. In the days that followed, he began correcting himself in conversations with others. He softened statements, adjusted timelines, introduced uncertainty where there had once been confidence. People noticed. They asked questions. He gave careful answers. That adjustment cost him something. Confidence once lost is difficult to reclaim. He came to me one evening and admitted he was worried. Not about me. About himself. He said he was afraid he had misunderstood the situation completely. I told him fear is not the enemy. Refusal to face it is. He asked me if I was angry. I told him anger had passed long before this. He asked what replaced it. I told him perspective. That answer confused him. I explained that anger focuses on offense. Perspective focuses on outcome. One burns energy. The other preserves it. He was quiet for a long time after that. I could feel the weight of realization settling in. Not dramatically. Gradually. Like a slow tightening around assumptions he had never questioned. He asked me if I thought things could still be fixed. I told him some things can be adjusted. Others must be understood first. He asked which category this situation belonged to. I told him understanding would come before adjustment. That was not the reassurance he wanted, but it was the truth. By then, the foundation of his plans had begun to crack. Not publicly, not yet, but internally. He could feel it. He could sense that the story he had been telling himself no longer matched the structure beneath it. He started waking earlier, staying up later, rechecking things. He was searching for control in a situation that no longer offered it freely. I did not interfere. Interference would have delayed learning. One afternoon, he said something that confirmed everything. He said he wished he had asked more questions earlier. I told him questions are always available. Pride just convinces us we do not need them. He did not argue. That acceptance mattered. But acceptance does not stop consequence. It only prepares you to face it without denial. The first real fracture did not announce itself. It arrived disguised as routine. A letter came in the mail one afternoon, addressed formally, placed among ordinary envelopes. He brought it inside without comment and set it on the counter with the rest. He did not open it right away. That hesitation mattered. People delay opening letters only when they fear what certainty might contain. Later that evening, I noticed it was still there. Unopened. He paced more than usual that night. Picked up his phone, put it down. Checked messages that were not new. When he finally opened the letter, he did it standing up, as if sitting would make the news heavier. I did not ask what it was. Questions offered too early interrupt learning. His expression did not change much, but his shoulders tightened. His breathing shifted. He folded the paper carefully, too carefully, and placed it back inside the envelope as if control over neatness could restore control over meaning. He did not mention it. But from that moment on, the air between us carried a different weight. Over the next few days, small things began to fail. Not catastrophically. Just enough to disrupt momentum. Appointments delayed. Approvals slowed. Conversations ended without clarity. Nothing dramatic enough to point to. Everything subtle enough to deny. He grew quieter. This was the phase most people misunderstand. They expect revenge to roar. They expect confrontation, exposure, humiliation. But real consequences rarely need witnesses. They only need timing. He asked me one morning if I had ever experienced something falling apart slowly. I said most important things do. He asked how I handled it when they did. I told him I listened more than I spoke. He nodded, distracted. He began revisiting paperwork he had ignored before. Opening folders. Searching emails. Reviewing documents with a focus that came too late. He was looking for reassurance in places where assumption had once been enough. What he found instead were gaps. Gaps created by neglect. By disinterest. By the belief that someone else was always handling details. That someone had been me. He did not accuse me. He did not thank me either. Gratitude often comes after consequences, not before. One afternoon, he sat across from me and asked a question he had avoided for years. He asked how the house had been structured legally. Not casually. Carefully. I looked at him and asked whether he wanted the short answer or the complete one. He hesitated, then said the complete one. That mattered. I told him the truth. I told him the house had never been as simple as he believed. That responsibilities were layered. That ownership was clear, but access was conditional. That agreements had been designed to protect stability, not convenience. I did not explain every detail. I explained enough. His face went pale. Not with fear. with recognition. He realized then that the ground beneath his plans had always belonged to reality, not confidence. He realized that his authority had been borrowed, not granted. He realized that assumptions had carried him far only because no one had challenged them before. He asked why I had never told him. I told him he had never asked. That answer landed harder than any accusation could have. He said he felt foolish. I told him foolishness is temporary. Arrogance lasts longer. He did not argue. That night, he stayed in his room, door closed, lights on. The house held silence again, but this time it was different. It was not strategic. It was reflective. The next morning, he apologized. Not dramatically. Quietly. He said he had misjudged me. I told him judgment requires full information. He said he had underestimated the situation. I told him most people do when things work too easily for too long. He asked whether things could still be reversed. I told him some things can be adjusted. Others must be accepted. He asked which applied here. I told him that depended on how he responded next. That uncertainty frightened him. People want timelines, clear outcomes, guarantees. Life rarely offers them. Over the following week, consequences accelerated. Not because I pushed them, but because momentum had shifted. People asked questions he could not answer confidently. Processes slowed where speed had once been assumed. Promises he had made without verification became obligations he could not fulfill easily. He tried to correct course. He worked longer hours, made more calls, asked for extensions. But effort cannot replace foundation. I watched him struggle with something new. Limitations. He had lived believing effort alone could overcome structure. Now he was learning that structure determines how far effort can go. One evening, he came home visibly shaken. He said someone had asked him a question he could not answer. He asked me if that had ever happened to me. I told him it happens to everyone eventually. He asked how I handled it. I told him I learned to ask questions before making promises. He looked at me then with something close to humility. Not defeat. Recognition. He said he wished he had listened earlier. I told him listening only matters when you are ready to hear. That week marked the true beginning of the conflict. Not externally. Internally. The fight was no longer between us. It was between who he believed himself to be and who reality was forcing him to become. He grew quieter still. More thoughtful. Less performative. He stopped speaking about the future with certainty. He stopped referring to the house as his. He stopped making assumptions aloud. That silence was not surrender. It was recalibration. But recalibration does not undo damage already done. The world does not pause to allow reflection. It continues forward, indifferent to readiness. By the end of that week, the consequences that had once been subtle became visible. Not to everyone. Just to those paying attention. He was paying attention now. He came to me one evening and asked whether I had ever planned for this outcome. I told him I had planned for responsibility. He asked whether responsibility always looks like distance. I told him sometimes distance is the only way clarity can survive. He did not respond. He understood. Once the reckoning begins, it does not rush. It settles in. The days that followed were not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no confrontations that could be pointed to and labeled as the moment everything changed. Instead, there was a steady narrowing of his world, like walls slowly moving inward without making a sound. He began waking earlier than before, not with purpose, but with worry. I could hear him moving around in his room before sunrise, the quiet footsteps of someone replaying conversations in his head. He stopped leaving the house with confidence. His departures were slower now, deliberate, as if he were bracing for something he could not quite name. At breakfast, he spoke less. When he did speak, it was careful, neutral. He no longer assumed agreement. He waited for it. That waiting was new. I continued as I always had. Predictable. Present. I did not change my schedule or my tone. Stability, when contrasted with uncertainty, becomes a mirror. It reflects what the other person lacks. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with the house on the surface, but everything to do with control underneath. Questions about long-term planning, about risk, about what it means to truly own something. I answered each one honestly. I did not simplify. I did not soften. Truth does not need decoration when someone is finally ready to hear it. One afternoon, he asked me how I learned to think the way I do. The question surprised me. I told him experience teaches you two things very quickly: what matters and what does not. I told him fear teaches urgency, but responsibility teaches patience. I told him most people confuse the two until life corrects them. He listened quietly. That silence was not resistance. It was absorption. The pressure around him continued to build, not because anyone was attacking him, but because systems he had relied on without understanding were no longer bending to his will. He discovered that flexibility is often a privilege granted to those who respect structure. He missed a commitment one afternoon. Not entirely, but enough to be noticed. Enough to raise questions. Enough to place a mark where there had once been none. He came home that night frustrated, not angry. Frustration is what follows when effort no longer produces expected results. He told me he felt like he was pushing against something invisible. I told him invisible forces are usually the strongest. He asked me what I meant. I told him systems do not announce themselves. They simply operate, regardless of confidence. That answer unsettled him. He began tracing backwards, revisiting decisions, questioning timelines, identifying moments where he had spoken instead of listened. The weight of those realizations slowed him down. He apologized again one evening. This time, it was different. It was not about tone or words. It was about assumption. He said he had assumed I would always adjust, that I would always adapt, that my patience meant I would always accommodate. I told him patience does not mean permanence. I told him it means tolerance until correction is required. He asked how he could have known when correction was coming. I told him correction always follows disrespect, even when disrespect is quiet. That was difficult for him to hear. He had never thought of himself as disrespectful. He had thought of himself as decisive, efficient, forward-moving. He was beginning to understand the difference. As the days passed, he stopped inviting others into the house, stopped discussing plans openly, stopped assuming outcomes. He retreated inward, trying to rebuild certainty from within. But certainty built in isolation is fragile. One evening, he asked me if I thought people ever get second chances. I told him second chances exist. Third assumptions are less forgiving. He nodded. He understood that he was not starting over. He was continuing from a point already shaped by consequence. He began to recognize something else too. That I was not enjoying this. That realization surprised him. He told me one night that he had thought I was proving a point. I told him I was protecting a principle. Points fade. Principles endure. That distinction changed how he looked at me. For the first time, he did not see me as opposition or obstacle. He saw me as something else. An anchor. Not something to push against, but something that holds steady when everything else shifts. That understanding softened him, but it did not save him from what was already in motion. The world outside the house does not care about realizations that come late. It operates on records, agreements, timelines, and responsibilities. Those things do not pause because someone has learned a lesson. He learned that the hard way. A conversation he had one afternoon did not go the way he expected. Not hostile, just firm. Boundaries were clarified. Assumptions corrected. Access limited. He came home quieter than usual. He did not speak during dinner. Later, he asked me if boundaries always feel like punishment. I told him boundaries feel like punishment only to those who benefited from their absence. He did not argue. That night, he did not turn on the lights in his room. He sat in the dark, thinking. I could feel it. The house carries those moods. It absorbs them. In the following days, he became more transparent. He admitted when he did not know something, asked before assuming, checked details he would have once dismissed. That growth mattered. But growth does not undo exposure. He asked me one morning whether I had ever failed. I smiled at that. I told him failure is not the absence of success. It is the moment you realize you misunderstood the game you were playing. He asked what game he had been playing. I told him the game of certainty without verification. He nodded slowly. That afternoon, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. He delayed something important. Not because he was forced to. Because he realized he was not ready. That choice cost him in the short term. But it saved him from something worse. I respected that. He began to understand that strength is not always about pushing forward. Sometimes it is about stopping before damage becomes irreversible. By the end of that period, the dynamic between us had changed completely. Not resolved. Not healed. Rebalanced. He no longer spoke to me as someone in the way. He spoke to me as someone who understood weight. But the conflict was not finished. Not yet. Because while internal reckoning reshapes character, external consequences still demand their due. And those consequences were about to arrive in a form that could not be ignored, softened, or delayed. This is the moment where many people break. Not because the truth is harsh, but because it is final. And finality, once reached, does not negotiate. The final consequence arrived without warning, but not without preparation. It came as confirmation. Not accusation. Not confrontation. Confirmation. He received a call late in the afternoon. I could tell it was different by the way his posture changed the moment he answered. He stopped pacing. Stopped interrupting. He listened. Fully. The way people listen when they know resistance will not help them. The call was not long. It did not need to be. When he hung up, he stayed where he was, phone still in his hand, eyes fixed on nothing. He did not look angry. He did not look betrayed. He looked exposed. That is the moment most people remember for the rest of their lives. The moment when denial finally releases its grip and reality stands alone, unchallenged. He did not speak for a long time. Neither did I. Silence, at that point, was not strategy. It was respect. For the weight of what had just landed. Eventually, he asked me if I already knew. I told him I had known it was coming. He asked how. I told him systems speak long before people do. You just have to be willing to listen. He leaned back, rubbed his face, and let out a breath that felt heavier than exhaustion. It was the sound of someone realizing there would be no shortcut through what came next. He said the call had changed everything. I told him change is rarely sudden. It only feels that way when you stop ignoring it. He asked what would happen now. That question mattered more than he realized. I told him now things would proceed as they always should have. According to record, not assumption. According to structure, not confidence. He nodded slowly. He was no longer resisting. That evening, he did something unexpected. He apologized again. But this time, it was not about behavior or tone or misunderstanding. It was about entitlement. He said he had confused proximity with authority, comfort with control, patience with permission. Those words mattered. They told me the lesson had landed. I told him acknowledging that does not erase consequence, but it does shape what comes after. He accepted that. Over the next few days, things moved quickly outside the house. Not dramatically. Efficiently. Processes corrected themselves once truth was acknowledged. Access adjusted. Responsibilities clarified. Limits enforced. He felt the impact immediately. Not ruin. Restriction. Restriction is harder for people who have always moved freely. He tried to manage it with composure, but I could see the strain. The recalibration was costing him energy. Confidence rebuilt on truth requires more effort than confidence borrowed from assumption. One evening, he admitted something quietly. He said he had built his plans assuming I would step aside. I told him that was clear. He asked why I had never corrected that assumption sooner. I told him because correction only works when the person is ready to receive it. Before that, it becomes noise. He nodded. He understood now that his readiness had arrived too late to avoid consequence, but not too late to avoid collapse. That distinction would save him later. The house felt different again. Not exposed this time. Grounded. He moved through it with awareness. He asked before changing things. He spoke with care. He no longer treated space as something he could claim by momentum alone. He had learned that presence does not equal ownership. One night, he asked me whether I felt satisfied. I answered honestly. I told him satisfaction was never the goal. Balance was. He asked whether balance had been restored. I told him balance is not a moment. It is a condition maintained through respect. He sat with that. The next question he asked surprised me. He asked whether I would have done anything differently. I thought about that carefully. Then I told him no. I told him intervention earlier would have taught obedience, not understanding. I told him confrontation would have created resentment, not growth. I told him silence had given him the space to reveal who he was becoming. That answer stayed with him. In the days that followed, he began making changes that were not required. He corrected himself when speaking. He took responsibility without being prompted. He stopped presenting certainty where there was none. Those changes did not undo the damage already done, but they prevented new damage. That mattered. One afternoon, he told me he felt like he had lost something important. I asked what. He said confidence. I told him he had lost false confidence. Real confidence comes later. He did not like that answer, but he accepted it. That night, the house was quiet in a way it had not been for a long time. Not tense. Not strategic. Honest. I realized then that the conflict had reached its true end. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing remained hidden. He no longer misunderstood his position. I no longer needed to protect mine. The reckoning was complete. Adjustment does not announce itself the way conflict does. It slips in quietly, reshaping habits before anyone notices they have changed. After everything settled into its new position, he began moving through life differently. Not cautiously, exactly. More deliberately. Like someone who has learned that speed without direction wastes more time than it saves. The first sign was how he started asking questions again. Real questions. Not the kind designed to confirm what he already believed, but the kind that accept uncertainty as part of the answer. He asked about processes. About timing. About consequences. He asked why certain things took longer than expected, and why others could not be rushed no matter how much effort he applied. I answered him the same way I always had. Directly. Calmly. Without urgency. He began taking notes. Not written ones. Mental ones. You can see when someone starts doing that. Their eyes linger. Their responses slow. They repeat parts of what you said, not to argue, but to understand. That was new. But adjustment is not the same as peace. Outside the house, the changes continued to ripple. Commitments were revised. Access narrowed. Expectations recalibrated. Nothing dramatic enough to point to as loss, but enough to feel the difference every day. He was learning the cost of correction. One evening, he came home later than usual and sat across from me without speaking. His posture told me he was carrying something heavy, not emotionally, but structurally. Something had shifted again. He finally said that he felt smaller. Not humiliated. Smaller. I asked him what he meant. He said he had been used to walking into rooms and being certain he belonged there. Now, he felt like he had to earn that certainty again. That people no longer assumed his authority. That he had to explain himself. I told him explanation is not weakness. Assumption is. He nodded, but the weight did not lift. This is the part most people do not talk about. When entitlement collapses, it leaves a vacuum. And that vacuum must be filled with something healthier, or it fills itself with resentment. I watched carefully. He was not resentful. He was tired. Tired from rebuilding confidence the right way. That matters. He began spending more time at home, not because he had nowhere else to be, but because the house had become a place of reflection instead of control. He sat longer at the table. He listened more than he spoke. One night, he asked me how I had managed after his mother passed. He had never asked that before. I told him the truth. I told him grief does not remove responsibility. It sharpens it. I told him that when you lose someone who anchored your life, you either collapse inward or you build structure outward. I chose structure. He asked whether that had been lonely. I told him loneliness is different from solitude. Solitude can be purposeful. He absorbed that quietly. Adjustment continued. He began letting go of some plans. Not because he was forced to, but because he recognized they were built on assumptions that no longer existed. Letting go is harder than losing. Loss happens to you. Letting go is a decision. He struggled with that. He spoke once about feeling behind. I told him comparison only works when everyone starts from the same place. He had not. Neither had I. That was the first time he seemed to truly understand the weight of legacy. Not inheritance, but responsibility carried forward without applause. The house itself reflected the change. He stopped rearranging things. Stopped replacing objects for the sake of novelty. He began restoring what he had moved. Not out of obligation, but respect. Each small action was a quiet acknowledgement of history. That mattered more than words. One afternoon, he asked whether I trusted him. That question deserved honesty. I told him trust is built in layers. He had damaged one, but others were still intact. I told him rebuilding trust is not about convincing someone. It is about consistency over time. He asked how long that would take. I told him as long as it takes. He did not argue. That acceptance was another sign of growth. Adjustment also brought friction. He grew frustrated at times. Snapped at situations that resisted him. Caught himself mid-sentence and stopped. Apologized without prompting. These moments were messy, imperfect, human. I allowed them. Correction does not require perfection. It requires direction. One evening, he admitted he was afraid. Not of me. Of becoming someone he did not respect. That admission was important. I told him fear can be useful if it guides you instead of freezing you. I told him the fact that he could name what he feared meant he was already changing. He sat with that. The next shift came quietly. He stopped referring to the house as temporary. He spoke about it as shared responsibility. Language reveals mindset. That was a meaningful change. But the story does not pivot on comfort. It pivots on choice. One morning, he told me he had declined an opportunity. Not because it was unavailable. Because it required assumptions he was no longer willing to make. That choice cost him status in the short term. But it protected him from repeating the same mistake. I respected that. He began seeking advice without expecting agreement. He listened even when the answers were inconvenient. He slowed his pace, not because he lacked ambition, but because he had learned the cost of misalignment. That was the adjustment. Not surrender. Alignment. Yet even alignment does not erase consequence. The systems that had corrected themselves did not reverse course. Access once limited does not automatically return. Trust once strained does not immediately reset. He felt that. One night, he said he wished he could go back. I told him going back teaches nothing. Going forward with awareness teaches everything. He did not respond right away. Then he said something that surprised me. He said he was grateful. Not for the difficulty. For the clarity. That gratitude told me the lesson had taken root. He began to notice details he had ignored for years. Little things at first. The way bills were organized, files stacked in neat piles, schedules that ensured nothing fell through cracks. Things that he had assumed existed by default, handled automatically, were not accidents, they were deliberate. I had done them for decades, quietly, without boasting. And now, he saw how fragile his assumptions had been. He began asking questions. Not interrogating, not testing, just asking. Why is this folder separate? Why is this procedure necessary? Who keeps track of this? I answered each one carefully. Not too much. Not too little. Enough to satisfy curiosity but never to cede authority. He learned slowly, painfully, that knowledge without experience is a dangerous foundation. One afternoon, he said he wanted to help with something. Not because I asked, but because he wanted to participate. I let him. We went through a stack of papers, contracts, insurance documents, household accounts. I watched as he read, paused, reread, sometimes scratching notes in a small notebook he had pulled from a drawer. He no longer assumed comprehension. He worked to achieve it. That effort mattered more than speed. When he made a mistake, and he did, it was small, human. He corrected it immediately, not defensively. That moment was telling. I told him, mistakes are evidence that you're learning. He looked at me and said, I've been afraid to make them before. Fear teaches discipline. But discipline without understanding becomes arrogance. He was learning both lessons at once. Over the next several days, he began taking responsibility for small decisions in the house. Nothing dramatic. The light bulbs he replaced, the garden he tended, the grocery lists he compiled. Every act mattered because it was deliberate, not automatic. He came to me one evening and said, I never realized how much you manage without anyone noticing. I told him, management is invisible when it works. But consequences appear immediately when it fails. That evening, we spoke longer than usual. He admitted he had thought adulthood meant independence without accountability. He said he had believed effort alone could guarantee outcomes. I told him that structure and understanding always outlast effort. He was silent for a long time. That silence was not avoidance. It was reflection. The following week, he faced a minor crisis. Not dangerous, not catastrophic, just a scheduling conflict that he could not fix with speed or charm. He hesitated, panicked slightly, then remembered the lesson. He paused, asked questions, listened, adapted, resolved it with calm deliberation. I watched, quietly approving. That moment confirmed his transformation was real. Not performative. Not temporary. Real. One evening, he asked me directly, Did you plan for me to learn all of this way? I told him, I didn't plan it. I just let life do what it does best. It teaches. He smiled faintly, almost embarrassed. That was humility forming. Later, he asked a question I had been waiting for. Do you forgive me? I paused. Forgiveness is not always given immediately. Sometimes it waits until understanding has matured. I told him, forgiveness is not needed when learning occurs. You've begun to understand what needed correction. That is enough. He looked relieved but also thoughtful. Relief is easy. Understanding is heavier. In the days that followed, he continued adjusting his behavior. He spoke more carefully to others. He sought guidance without expecting agreement. He accepted corrections without defensiveness. Even small successes now carried weight. He learned that influence is not the same as authority. That confidence without knowledge can mislead. That patience, not urgency, secures outcomes. One afternoon, he came to me and said, I want to be better than I was, not just in the house, but at work, everywhere. I told him, then start with what you can control. That is all anyone ever has. He nodded. I watched him take deliberate steps each day. Nothing dramatic. Nothing performative. But consistent. That consistency reshaped the household, the way people interacted, the tone in conversations. The subtle gravity he had once lacked was returning, but as awareness, not arrogance. He even started helping neighbors without announcement. Offering advice quietly. Fixing small problems that no one had asked him to notice. Leadership born from observation rather than assertion. One night, he admitted something to me quietly. I've been proud for the wrong reasons. I never realized how much I was leaning on other people's work. I told him, most people only realize that when they lose it. You're lucky you learned before real damage was done. He paused and nodded, thinking about that. The next few days, he began correcting old habits. Not dramatically. No one would notice immediately. But habits shape character quietly. He cleaned areas he had ignored. He filed documents properly. He stopped speaking as if decisions were final before understanding consequences. One morning he asked, almost hesitantly, "Do you think I can ever fully earn back trust?" I said, "Trust is not earned once. It is maintained every day. If you commit to that, it grows naturally." That was a turning point. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a revelation, but a steady acceptance. He understood now that stability is earned quietly, patiently, consistently. From that day forward, he began approaching life differently. He no longer assumed outcomes. He no longer skipped steps. He did not seek shortcuts. Every action carried intention. This is the essence of adjustment. It is not visible in a single act. It cannot be dramatized easily. But it is effective. And it is permanent. By the end of this segment, the house had changed in atmosphere. Not physically, but emotionally. Calm, quiet respect replaced subtle tension. Mutual understanding replaced silent competition. He had begun to see me not as an obstacle, but as a guide. And while life outside would continue testing him, he now possessed tools he lacked before. Patience, awareness, humility, and respect for systems larger than himself. The calm did not last long, not because conflict returned, but because reality always demands its due. He had learned patience, humility, and careful attention. But knowledge alone does not shield someone from consequences already set in motion. The systems around him were impartial. The agreements he had assumed he controlled were enforced by process, not generosity. The world outside would not pause for understanding. It never does. One morning, he received a message about a financial matter he had overlooked for weeks. Not something catastrophic, but enough to remind him that oversight carries weight. He called me quietly, almost apologetically, to ask what to do. I told him exactly what I would do. He followed my instructions without argument. Not because I forced him to, but because he had learned that strategy guided by experience outweighs certainty built on assumption. That small incident became a turning point. Not because of its material impact, but because he realized he could no longer rely on intuition alone. He had to verify, consider, and respect the systems that held everything together. Over the next few days, he continued making careful decisions. He double-checked details, questioned himself, and asked for input without expecting approval. One afternoon, he said something quietly, almost to himself, "I never realized how much I depended on things I didn't see." I told him, most people only notice when those things stop working. He nodded, understanding fully for the first time the gap between appearance and reality. That evening, he approached me with another question. "Did you ever plan for me to understand all of this?" I smiled. "I don't plan lessons. Life delivers them. You just have to pay attention." He paused and let that sink in. Then he asked, "And if I fail?" I told him, failure is temporary. Ignoring lessons is permanent. He absorbed that quietly. No protest. No excuse. Just reflection. Days passed, and he began acting with more responsibility than before. He managed small repairs, household scheduling, and interactions with neighbors carefully, not for recognition, but because he understood the stakes. He spoke less impulsively. He asked more. He observed more. One evening, he admitted, "I used to think being in charge meant being fast, decisive, and unopposed. I see now that it means understanding, patience, and respect." I told him that realization is more important than speed or control. It is the foundation of lasting influence. That night, we spoke quietly about decisions he had made in the past without understanding the full picture. He admitted his mistakes, not in dramatics, but with honesty. "I wish I had known what I know now," he said. I told him, "You do now. That matters more than regret." He began making amends quietly. Apologies were spoken to those affected. Commitments were adjusted. Misunderstandings clarified. The transformation was subtle, not loud, but it reshaped relationships and the energy of the household. One morning, he approached me again. "Do you trust that I've changed?" I told him, "Trust is not a one-time gesture. It is measured by consistency over time. Show me that, and the rest will follow naturally." He nodded, determination in his eyes. From that point forward, he made deliberate efforts to maintain clarity in communication and accountability in action. He began to anticipate consequences before acting, consult others when needed, and recognize the value of guidance and perspective. It was not instant redemption. The lessons he had ignored could not be erased, but they could be internalized. And that is what he began to do. One afternoon, he said something quietly that struck me deeply. "I feel like I've finally started living in the real world, not the one I imagined for myself." I told him, reality is rarely gentle, but it is always honest. He smiled faintly. Not triumphant, not relieved, just grounded. Over the following week, he took steps that once would have seemed unnecessary or tedious. He organized accounts, verified commitments, and approached conversations with thoughtfulness. Small decisions carried weight now, and he understood that each choice mattered. I watched quietly, satisfied, not because I had orchestrated this, but because the system of consequence and patience had done its work. He had experienced failure, reflection, and accountability, and he had emerged changed. One night, he approached me and asked, "Did I ever make you angry?" I told him, "Anger is fleeting. Disappointment lasts longer. But you have corrected course, and that is what matters." He reflected on that. Then he said softly, "I want to do right from now on, not because I have to, but because I understand." I told him, "That is the difference between obedience and wisdom. You are learning both." In the days that followed, the household continued smoothly. Responsibilities were met without friction. Communication became clear. Trust, once strained, began to rebuild. The energy between us shifted from subtle tension to quiet respect. The true test of his growth would come not from external validation, but from his ability to maintain this awareness consistently. And he had shown signs he was ready.